Morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope you all are doing great. So, this is our course, Media and Peace Building, and we are in Module 5. We are completing Module 5. So, let's start today's lecture. Previously, we were discussing academic and professional debate and criticism in peace journalism. So we completed part one, where we discussed different definition that what kind of criticism is being done on peace journalism, and we discussed objectivity, and we discussed some points from American Society of News Editors and gate concept of gatekeeping. So today we'll discuss uh, part two. So let me load my PowerPoint presentation. So, let's discuss criticism on this construct. Um, Aside from objectivity, there are a number of other arguments that are against peace journalism. And the justification for peace journalism has been put forth. So, what are those criticisms? They include these following types of criticism on um, peace journalism. So, peace is not a journalist's job. So there is a whole lot of criticism that promoting peace, working for peace, and um, doing peace journalism is not the job of a journalist. So, G. Gelatin pointed out that there is no necessity for journalists to place their professional abilities in the service of either conflict resolution or prevention. Why? Because he believes that their job is to just simply do their work better in the frame of the traditional standards of their profession. They should not be taking sides of being peace journalists or promoting peace. But if peace journalism is nothing other than good journalism, isn't this just old wine in a new bottles? So David Lawrence says, he adds that reporting and peacemaking are different roles, and that peacemaking is simply not the journalist's responsibility. And it cannot be the function of journalism to mediate between two conflict parties, to sit down at a negotiating table with them and moderate their disputes. Peace journalism's defenders counter that journalists should use their professional abilities to serve the public. So these are two sides. One side says that it is not the job of a peace journalist to moderate between two parties that are on a conflict. While defenders, they say that because journalists are important people, they have this power to reach to masses, and they have those professional abilities to serve the public. If they can do something better for the public, why shouldn't they do? So if this is so, then what higher service can journalists provide then to help the public understand the nature of conflict and to present peaceful options to the public? So as Samuel noted, preventing a conflict from escalating and diverting it from a destructive to a constructive path is not merely a journalist's job, but rather everyone's job, whether you are a journalist or not. So nowhere in the peace journalism literature is there a suggestion that journalists sit down at a negotiating table and act as mediator. So it's not job of a peace journalist to act as a mediator. Rather, as was presented earlier, peace journalists can serve a mediating function merely through the performance of their jobs. So they should actually look into the angle, the way they are reporting their stories. Media distorted reality misses the point. That is another. So, researcher Thomas Henry wrote, what about he called fallacies and oversimplifications in peace journalism. So the argument including what he said is a naive epistemological perspective on the part of peace journalist supporter. He writes about how peace journalism assumes one true and proper version of reality and criticizes traditional journalism for misrepresenting reality. So according to Goldtong, for instance, the practice of traditional war reporting presents reality in a distorted way. So I have argued elsewhere that these complaints about a media distorted reality actually miss the point. The media by nature cannot provide an objective representation of reality that is objective in the sense of being identical with the reality. So news is not a mirror of reality. You should understand this. It is representation of the world, and all representations are selective, and they have different kind of angles and different kind of representations. So in the world full of contingent descriptions of reality, war correspondents can only provide one version of reality that is just as true as numerous other versions are true. Furthermore, peace journalism does not, as Harry suggests, assume that only one true and proper version of reality exists. Instead, inherent in its principles is the notion that there are many versions of reality, and that indeed a journalist's responsibility is to present as many versions of reality as possible to listeners and readers and viewers. All too often, traditional war journalism presents only one propaganda list elitist version of reality. So contemporary journalism assumes casual linear media effects. So another problem of peace journalism movement is that it adheres to a large extent to the assumption of powerful casual and linear media effects, thus overestimates the power of journalism and understands the impact of interpersonal communication. So this view simply connects readily with an anarchist conceptualization of audience as a mass, as an aggregate composed of dispersed individuals whose characteristics are of only modest consequences of understanding of mass communication. So if conceptualization of the audience as a mass coincides with the demands for socially responsible journalism, fatal misjudgments are difficult to avoid. So peace journalism supporters would respond that hundreds of studies and decades of observation by sociologists and media researchers like Walter Lippmann, Joseph Wagner, and Neil Postman verifies that impact of mass media on public perceptions creating a mediated culture. So the debate about the exact nature and impact of media on culture and society is an ongoing process. So the debate though is not if media impacts society, but how much impact exists over there. So even there is no clarity about the content of the casual and linear media effects or the conceptualization of audience as a mass, so what? The criticism addresses only the extent of peace journalism effect anyway, and not the existence of the effect itself. So Lynch's research proves that how stories are framed, traditional versus peace journalism, is understood by the positively impacts audience. The critics point that the impact of interpersonal communication may be understood is also noted. Even if this is so, once again, this is disputed about the extent and not the existence of media's impact. So journalism is just reflecting society, giving audiences what they want. There's another debate that says that journalism is often treated with poor contextualization by the advocates of peace journalism. It seems to me that they tend to hold journalism responsible for virtually everything what's going wrong with culture and society. So journalism is constantly blamed for the criteria of news selection, such as negativism, personalization, as well as proximity to elite persons and elite countries. And scholars are quick to attribute these criteria to journalism as if they came out from nowhere. But the criteria of news selection are structures of selection in public communication, and they are subject to continuous negotiation between journalism and its audiences. That means journalism present what audience want. Granted, audience studies shows that what people want most are stories of natural and human-made disasters, unusual weather fluctuations, war and terrorism, and perhaps a dose of delectations and trivia. This is sad indeed, but why should journalism ignore its audience? I mean, whatever you are watching on your television, there is a huge lot debate that journalism does this, it does that, but actually journalism is audience driven. If something is coming on your television screen, if you are watching violence repeatedly on your television screen, that means media is bound to show that violence because audience want it. Now, again, there is another debate that why audience want violence, why they like stories regarding violence or human-made disasters or robberies or bloodshed, why they like such kind of stories, because media has made their mind to basically watch such kind of stories. So this is an ongoing debate. So this is, in the nutshell, journalism is just reflecting society, giving audience what they want. That's what we discuss. So peace journalism supporters would point out that new studies rebut the notion that audiences are only interested in weather, crime, war, and terrorism, even though those topics do admittedly draw in ratings and readers. The critics suppose that journalists should simply give audience what they want. However, good journalism, and not just peace journalism, has always understood its responsibility to lead and not just follow. So researches shows that when journalists lead, audience will respond positively. In an article published in Peace Journalist magazine, Lynch writes about a 3-year study that he and Annabel McGoldrick undertook that built on the research of William Kemphoff. This study shows that audiences are receptive to peace journalism stories, and indeed that these stories had a profound and significant impact on audiences. So need of peace process journalism are incompatible. So there is an inherent contradiction between the logic of a peace process and the professional demands of journalists. A peace process is complicated. Journalists demand simplicity. A peace process takes time to unfold and develop. Journalists demand immediate results. So most of the peace process is marked by dull, tedious negotiation, and journalists require drama. A successful peace process leads to a reduction in tension, while journalists focus on conflict. So many of the significant developments within a peace process must take place in secret behind closed doors. So journalists demand information and action. So one could contend that this is actually an argument for peace journalism. So Wolf felt correct in pointing out the in So he pointed out between the traditional journalism and the practices and peace process. So traditional is televised because peace journalists propose to operate differently in a way that demands analysis, context, depth, and balance. And peace journalists would never demand simplicity. So traditional journalism has failed in covering peace. That is the conclusion. So peace journalism is a prescriptive, requires seeking out peacemakers. So several critics have pointed out that what they believe peace journalism is prescriptive nature, that is somehow imposes a code or guidelines on journalists. So David Loyne, for one, chafs at peace journalism attempts to define itself as a new orthodoxy. So what is proposed by the advocates of peace journalism is a prescription defining a way of working which demands the reporters artificially seek out peacemakers. This prescriptive nature alone should make it suspect. So the searching inquiry carried out into BBC journalism for a former senior news manager, Ron Neal, explicitly ruled out this kind of approach, saying highly prescriptive rules inhabit good journalism. So David Lloyd goes on to lambast Lynch and McGoldrick over a list they publish of peacemakers who should be sought out by the reporters. So he wrote, this is more idealistic than the rest of the wishful thinking in their book. But it also makes a mockery of the demand that journalists seek out peacemakers. So when activists like Lynch and McGoldrick make difference, they are given proper prominence. In response to do peace journalists artificially seek out peacemakers, the word artificial is certainly loaded with meaning. It is artificial to balance one story with both pro and con sources. So peace journalists would have to hold back disruptive information. Should journalists hold back certain facts from public attention when they think that this information could cause subsequent acts of violence after the news has been published or broadcasted? Who will define what facts are eligible to be reported and what information may be disrupt your social order? Might be what you are thinking, that this information, if you stop this information from being broadcasted or published, you are going to save people from violence. But what if you are wrong? Then how far is it to be legitimization of government controls imposed on press in the name of social stability, as experienced by many Asian nations and as experienced by us in Pakistan? So this criticism reflects a misinterpretation of the dogma of peace journalism, none of which suggests that news should be ignored or sugarcoated. Considering the consequences of one's reporting does not mean setting aside a downplaying unpleasant or potentially inflammatory news. So what it does mean is that peace journalists would take care of to frame and word the story in such a way that at minimum it does not exacerbate the situation or the violence. So no journalist should hold back certain facts, but they should not sensationalize them either. So these facts should be presented alongside voices that offer non-violent solution. So who determines what facts are reported? As they always have, journalists should determine what should be reported and um, what should be stayed back using their training and best judgment. Finally, peace journalism defenders would point out that it is an enormous illogical leap to suggest, as some critics have, that media self-regulation that includes peace journalism principle somehow leads down the slippery slope to the government controls. So journalist is not the problem, society and cultures are. That is another debate. So journalists are the offspring of their societies and their cultures. So why should one expect journalists to be better human than are their readers, viewers, and listeners? Because journalism comes from us. Simply because journalism has a deep impact on public opinion, isn't it more likely that in a culture which does not regard the peaceful settlement of the conflict to be an essential value, peace journalism will be meaningless and mostly ineffective? There is an impressive historical record which made quite obvious that journalism has only limited capability and power to fundamentally challenge society and culture. Hence, if we really want to make this world a better place, we should not start with journalism. Again, peace journalism supporters would again invite a pursuit of the disciplines principle as a method of rebutting this argument. Has anyone in the peace journalism movement ever written or suggested that peace is something to be achieved only by through media, or that a search for a peaceful society must start with journalism? Absolutely not. Peace journalism does not naively believe either that it exists in a vacuum or that it alone can solve the world's problem. Goldtong and others see peace journalism as only one part of much bigger peace building, and conflict studies movement. It is a one tool. So Samuel Pledge further expand on the criticism notion that journalism is not the problem and therefore not accountable for the conflict. So this is an interesting claim which deflects the onus of social accountability and commitment from the agent to the environment. So in the conclusion, if I put the whole debate into the nutshell, from the peace journalism perspective, the criticism seems to be misrepresented, misunderstood, exaggerated, and split hairs. That precise impact of media influence on public perception. For example, regardless of one's perspective, the academic debate about the nature and advisability of peace journalism is worthwhile since it has sparked an ongoing discussion in the profession and among academics about the moral and ethical responsibility of the reporters. And for those who practice and teach peace journalism worldwide, like the Center of Global Peace Journalism or the Peace Journalism Foundation in Uganda, these debates are informative and interesting, but ultimately the whole debate is quite abstract. Um, I'm not saying that it's abstract; it's in the vacuum, but still, peace journalism is relatively a new concept compared to the contemporary journalism. Like media ethics is kind of a new debate. Similarly, peace journalism is also a new debate. So there should be an ongoing debate process on peace journalism. So thank you very much for having me. We'll meet on Thursday with a new lecture. Till then, take care of yourself. Allah Hafiz. Bye bye.